Thank you. So I had a problem getting here last year, and now I'm gonna have a problem getting home this year. I got notification that my flight was canceled, so I'm actually driving to Orlando to fly out tomorrow morning. So I think that's my best option of getting home tomorrow. But love being here. Love the Southeast. Anytime I can get out here and especially interact with dairy producers, I enjoy it. So I'm glad I was able to get out here this year and share a little bit of information with you guys. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about, I'm going to focus mostly on the calf today because that's what I do mostly. And I want to talk about different strategies to improve the health and well-being of these animals. And so before I start throwing some different things at you, I think we first need to understand, like, why are calves so susceptible to disease? And I give a presentation and I go in pretty in depth on the different immune aspects. I'm going to keep it pretty high level today, though. I'm going to go here. So the first thing I want to talk about is, why do pre-wean calves get sick? And a lot of it has to do with development of the gastrointestinal immune system of those animals. And then I want to look at, how can nutrition play a role in improving the health of these calves, not only in the hutch, but also if we set the calf up in the hutch, they're going to do better when they move to the weaning pens. And we know those animals will do better once they're in your lactation strain. And so I always look at it from a mechanistic standpoint. How can nutrition actually improve the health of animals? And here's a couple different strategies. We can use nutrition to actually reduce the interaction of a potential pathogen with the calf. Okay, so I'll talk about binders and some things that can actually bind different bacteria or different toxins in the gastrointestinal tract. There's also ways we can stimulate the immune system. So I'm not a pathologist, but I will show some slides of some intestinal tissue, and it's gonna be very clear which one looks good and which one doesn't, okay? And so there's a lot of things in nutrition that can actually improve the health of the gut, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about some of those, and then I'll spend a little less time talking about the adaptive immune system, but think of that as like vaccines. So we can do some things that will actually improve the ability of your animals to respond to vaccines. So we know that the risk of mortality greatly reduces in the first couple of weeks of life. Okay, I always joke with people. I have 3 little kids, and every time they were born and people came to the hospital, I was always really nervous. Like, my mother-in-law gets her face in front of like the kids, and I'm like, hey, I told my wife, I was like, can't we just get them to 3 weeks of life and then we can have people come over? You know, because I've raised a lot of calves and I know that there's this little magic number, 2 to 3 weeks. You know, they're a little bit more bulletproof, a little bit more bulletproof than they were at 3 days of age. Okay, so you can always see I was always really nervous around babies. Maybe that was just my excuse. I didn't have to change too many diapers, but so what's changed in the calf during this period? So I just want to briefly look at a few things. And again, I don't want to go into a lot of details. If you want to know a lot more about the mechanisms that change, I can send you some information, but some components of the GI system develop only after birth. So the calf is born with a fairly naive intestines. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22 situation. We know that intestines has to be able to absorb immunoglobulins because they don't get them in utero, but they can also absorb a lot of other things too, potential pathogens, okay? And we also know that colostrum can be dirty and what we mean by dirty is that there's a lot of bacteria in it. And if you feed a high count colostrum, they're going to absorb a lot of those bacteria as well. Okay, so we can see some problems there. But the problem is that intestine stays somewhat permeable for a period of more than just like what we've always been taught. You got to get colostrum there within 24 hours. And that's true. Okay, and I would even say it's less than 12 hours. Okay, but it is permeable to other things. Okay, you're not going to absorb a lot more IgG, but if you put some E. coli or some other pathogens on that intestines or expose it, they're going to be susceptible to it because it's still developing. And it's going to develop over a period of days to a couple weeks. So again, the ideal situation in the calf is we absorb adequate antibodies, get no absorption of microorganisms, but then we start maturing that gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so we start rapidly maturing it. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some information today about like post day 1 colostrum feeding. Okay, so a lot of you probably have heard, feed a little bit of colostrum in your milk for the first 7 to 10, 14 days. Okay, it's probably less. There's some benefit of the IgGs there. They're not getting absorbed, but they're in the intestines, There's some benefit there, but there's a lot of other bioactives in colostrum. And what those bioactives are doing is they're helping mature the gastrointestinal tract. Okay. So I'll show you a few pictures of that. There's a lot of different components to the immune system. I used to go through the different layers. Okay. So, and I put people to sleep, and I can be pretty entertaining if I need to be. You're going to get just this one slide. Okay. So there, just understand there's lots. There's a physical barrier, there's a chemical barrier, there's an immunological barrier, and then there's a microbial barrier. Sorry. And all of those are trying to protect the gut. I mean, at the end of the day, animals are mostly exposed, including yourself, are mostly exposed to microorganisms via food, via what you breathe in. And if you're a woman and have a child, you know, you can also get it through the urogenital tract. I mean, that's how we get exposed to microorganisms on our mucosal surfaces. And the digestive tract is one of the main sources that we get exposed to microorganisms. So what role can nutrition play in reducing enteric disease? So I'm going to put quite a few different supplements. So I've done 20 years of research looking at different strategies to improve the gut health of animals. So I'll just list, it's a non-exhaustive list. I'm going to show a list, and I'm not even going to talk about all those. So post day one colostrum feeding is what I'll talk first about. So feeding low levels of milk, colostrum in milk for, you know, a few days. I'll also talk about bovine serum plasma proteins as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about yeast cell walls. A lot of us have probably heard the word moss in our life. We saw it on the slide just a little bit ago, biomass too. And we'll talk a little bit about how moss can be utilized in diets, both in young and older animals, and what's specifically in those yeast cell wall fractions, particularly the moss and the beta glucan fractions. So we'll talk about those, but you can also look at live yeast. Yeast cultures also have some impact. Some direct-fed microbials, so the generic name being probiotics. So I'll talk a little bit about some data on some direct-fed microbials and how they influence the gut. Butyric acid, I won't talk about it because it stinks if you've ever got it on your hand. But there is some benefit. And butyric acid, really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a food source for the intestinal cells. So hyperimmunized egg proteins, there's some information there. And then I want to focus on some newer data that we've been doing with some absorbents that bind like salmonella and E. coli. And so we've been using those more recently, both from a food safety standpoint, but also from an animal health standpoint. Like salmonella, like a lot of my research in the last, I would say 5 to 7 years is really focused on reducing salmonella. And it's kind of like a pre-harvest food safety. Because salmonella, it likes to hide out in tissues. And so from a beef standpoint, you know, when you make hamburger, you grind up a lot of stuff, including lymph nodes. And the problem is we found out that salmonella likes to hide out in lymph nodes. So we really want to try to reduce exposure and colonization of salmonella in our animals, not only to improve animal health, but also to improve food safety. So just kind of keep that kind of tucked in the back of your head. So I'll focus on some data looking at absorbance in a little bit. So again, generally speaking, I have a lot of people call me and say, hey, I have this thing. I think we have good data in the field that shows that it improves the health of animals. Okay, what is it? And I can remove about 50% of them because they don't even make scientific sense. So I'm always like, there's got to be a mechanism that this is working. Like, what's the mechanism that this is working? Or at least you think it's working. So generally speaking, like the way nutrition can improve immunity, you know, looking at competitive inhibition, so it's competing against some type of pathogen. It's binding or absorbing that pathogen so it can't, it's basically putting it in handcuffs so it's less, can cause less damage. Does it produce antimicrobial factors? So there's various things we can feed, particularly like live microorganisms that can produce almost like natural antimicrobial factors that will compete against potential pathogens. Low pH is something too. You typically want a fairly low pH, can limit the growth of quite a few bacterial pathogens. Organic acids or ways to disrupt a cell wall are some different mechanisms that, as we go through, I'll kind of highlight those. And then stimulate other mucosal defenses. So we'll go through that. That's kind of boring stuff, but okay. So anytime we do a calf study, we bring them into our barn, we take a blood sample, we look at IgG levels. And we stratify our barn by it and then randomize our treatments relative to that. So I always have my low total serum or low IgG calves on one side of the barn, and then they get better. And we do a lot of harvesting of calves and take a lot of intestinal samples. My students, this was from about 10 years ago, these pictures. My students were complaining that they're having a hard time making the slides, the microscope slides of the animals on the low total serum protein side. They're just like, they don't slice real well. And so we went back and just started looking at some of those. And I'm like, so this was a calf that was a low total serum protein, so didn't get really good colostrum management. And this was an animal that got really nice colostrum management. The thing you need to understand, you may not know that this looks a lot better than this, but you want long finger-like pill-eye projections, okay? So I'll show data today that talks about villi height. That's the height of the villi in the intestines. You want that. It's a lot of surface area, able to absorb, able to respond to things. This is, when you think of like leaky gut, I mean, this thing is leaky, okay? This is not a very good, this is like say you live, this is your house, your family lives here. This is like your front door, okay? This is bolted shut, nobody's getting through here. This is like front door is open, lights on, sign out front. I have a lot of money, please come steal from me. And that's kind of what this is looking like. So when we talk about maturing the intestines, we talk about trying to take something that looks like this and make it look like this. I was working with a pathologist at the vet school to develop a scoring system to quantify how healthy does the gut look. And the first time he gave me the data back, it was just text. He's not a big time researcher. It was just, I was like, I can't analyze text. I mean, there may be some way, but I was like, I need some type of scoring system. And so we went through that process. But the interesting thing, just interacting with him, he's like, he was talking about how poorly these intestines looked. And he's like, were these the ones that were challenged with salmonella? And I was like, no, those are the control animals. So it was just interesting talking with him, that looking at just like 14 and 21 day old samples of the intestines, he already was saying that they were really a lot of inflammation and a lot of damage already. And so that's what got me thinking, okay, what are some strategies that we can start improving what that intestines looks like? Okay, so I want to talk first about post day one colostrum. So this was an idea that we had a while back. I'd always known, I wrote an article in Feedstuffs magazine in like the late or early 2000s on the non-IgG benefits of colostrum. We know that there's a lot of things in colostrum that have benefits, and there are a lot of growth hormones, and there's a lot of these receptors for those growth hormones in the intestines. So we started looking at this like, okay, what if we kind of made a transition milk for like 3 days or 7 days and fed some IgGs? So some folks had done this. And I'm just going to go through some data. I'll try to show you what they did. They fed 64. I tried to standardize across studies what they did. So I'll tell you the grams of IgGs they were feeding per day. They did this for 14 days. They fed a huge amount of IgGs. So this is typical research. This is not cost effective to do this, okay? But typically when we have a question or a hypothesis, we say, okay, let's do the extreme, see if it works there. Then we can titrate it back and figure out, is there something that makes sense from a cost effective? So this data, just keep in mind, they did something that, I mean, you'd probably have $200 into this calf by 14 days. So again, nobody's going to do this. What was very underwhelming is that the data weren't that impressive either. So they threw the kitchen sink at it, and I'll be honest with you, I'm underwhelmed by this data. No difference in body weight or performance, okay? There was not a small difference, but there was a difference in the number of animals treated with antibiotics. So 19%, those calves that were fed colostrum for 14 days in their milk, 19% of them were treated with antibiotics, 70% of the control animals were treated with antibiotics. So that was the big difference, okay? No difference in mortality, no difference in performance. Still going to be difficult to pay for on just a reduction in antibiotic use. Okay, so they backed down. I think the last study was closer to 60 grams per day. Now we're down to 20 grams per day of IgG. And in my typical recommendation, I'm anywhere from 6 to 10. That's my commercial recommendations today is like 6 to 10. So again, you can kind of see we're probably about 2 times the amount of IgGs. So again, feeding a healthy amount, we should see a good response, right? So this study was done on a calf ranch in California, if I remember that correctly. No difference in mortality relative to the treatment. There was a difference in mortality of calves that had failure of passive transfer. They didn't do it. More of them died than calves that got good colostrum management. But there was no difference in mortality with treatment. This is looking at the percentage of calves that developed scours or that had not developed scours. So 100% of the calves didn't have scours when they were born. That's good. It's a bad thing if they come out of the cow with scours. I've actually never seen it, but so they all started, none of them had scours. So as they start dropping, like this gets to 50%. So 50% of the calves in the control group were treated for scours, whereas only 25% of the colostrum fed calves were treated for scours. Again, a little underwhelming when you look at this data, this early data. More recent stuff out of Michigan State, they looked at the effects of feeding transition milk or milk replacer that they supplemented with colostrum replacer. So they had 3 treatments: fed milk replacer, fed transition milk that they milked from the transition, like 2nd, 3rd, 4th milking, or they took milk replacer and added some colostrum to it to kind of simulate transition milk. They saw some reduced inflammation, a measure of in blood. Okay, maybe a little bit of a tendency to see a little less goopy eyes. They at least got an improvement in body weight gain. So they got about a 6.6 pound improvement in weaning weights. Okay, still tough to pay for that. A 5-6 pound improvement in weaning weight, you could argue that's tough to pay $25 to do. Okay. Here was something I thought was a little bit more interesting is when they looked at transition milk and intestinal development in neonatal calves. So they fed transition milk and then they harvested those calves and looked at the intestinal section. They saw huge improvements in the gut health of those animals. Okay, huge improvements in the gut health of those animals in terms of the size of the villi in all sections of the intestines they looked at. So it was doing what I expected it to do, all those bioactives kind of stimulating, getting that healthy tissue, but we're not seeing a huge difference in weaning weight, and we're not seeing a huge difference. Maybe, I mean, you could argue that we're seeing a little bit of a reduction in scours, you know. So here's my take home on it, because I talked to a lot of dairy producers and a lot of calf raisers, and I have a lot of guys that are doing this, okay? And they believe in it and they see it in their facility. And that's what I always tell them. I said, here's some plans. Let's implement it and see if you see it on your facility. Because some of this may be why we're not seeing a difference, maybe the facility, okay? And I'll be honest with you, because I do think there's some benefit. And I think the data show that it is improving gut health, but it may not be translating on a facility. So it really depends on the facility. I'll skip over this for the sake of time, but so I want to talk a little bit about spray-dried plasma. Spray-dried plasma has been has been around for a long time. It was used in the swine industry for a long time. It's not so much anymore. But it's also been added into a lot of milk replacer formulations for quite some time. So some data it's 25 years old. And this is a really funny looking way they reported the data. It was just 6 calves, this first one, but I just want to kind of show it to you. This is calf 1, C1, C2, C3. And then this is the age of the calf. The thing I'll just point out is they challenged them with E. coli and rotavirus here. And when you get a little cross by it, that means the calf died, okay? All the other stuff means they had scours. At what period did they have scours? What period did they have fever? So they all had fevers and scours, but they all had little crosses next to their little pens at some point. Here are the 3 calves that were fed spray-dried plasma. It also has some IgGs in it, so there is some local protection there, but there's also quite a bit of other things in plasma that could be improving the health of these calves too. What you'll notice is the 3 calves, I don't see any little crosses, so they all survived the observation period. You know, they did get fevers, they did have elevated rectal temperatures and things like that, but they recovered, okay? And so, again, a lot of what I look at in terms of how can nutrition improve health, you're trying to prevent enough disease that you allow that animal to recover. We're also trying to prevent disease, but you'll also see, and I'll show you some data where I've had 100% of animals get sick. We made them sick, okay? But the big impact was that we had more animals survive and stay as productive animals. Okay, so that's the way I look at a lot of these things. I think spray-dried plasma will reduce your incidence of scours, but I also think it can improve the recovery from animals that did get scours, if that makes sense. So transitioning a little bit, talking about yeast cell walls. So you'll hear yeast cell wall, or you might hear moss, or you might hear beta glucans, and you might hear somebody say, well, my beta glucans are from mushrooms, not from yeast. Okay, the fact of the matter is yeast cell wall is kind of a crude, it's just the wall of a yeast. And the interesting thing about what's in the yeast cell wall is some of these functional carbohydrates, like mannan oligosaccharides and beta glucans. And so they're in the cell wall. You know, the interesting, so if you hear yeast cell wall, it's usually just kind of a crude extract. The interesting thing about the mannan oligosaccharides is they're typically associated with the protein. Okay, so mannan protein. And so you can remove some of that protein. And our experiences is when you modify that protein structure, you actually increase, I think, the availability of the mannan oligosaccharides. So a moss is not a moss, is just kind of one thing I'll put out there. And I think the next slide will show some of that. But so this is just looking at the ability, and really moss kind of gained some traction in its ability to bind gram-negative bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. So this was an assay that we developed to quantify the ability to bind E. coli. And so these are 5 different yeast cell wall or moss extracts. And then looking at E. coli binding, so that the bigger is better, Salmonella binding, Salmonella double binding. These are just control, the 3 bars on the left. So my point here is that there's some variability in terms of its ability to bind. But generally speaking, all these yeast cell wall or moss extracts bound E. coli and Salmonella. There was a nice study that was done somewhere in Europe that looked at 17 different yeast cell wall extracts, and they were able to correlate the ability to bind E. coli and Salmonella with the mannan content. Okay, so the yeast cell walls that had the highest mannan content bound the most E. coli and Salmonella, and that's kind of what our data suggests as well. So we took that out of the lab, we fed it to some calves, so we fed some yeast cell wall, and we basically got a 5-point improvement in weaning weight in those calves just by feeding yeast cell wall, 3 grams of yeast cell wall in the milk. Okay. We had another treatment in that study that was looking at feeding a direct fed microbial. So that'll kind of translate us into this. So what is a probiotic or a direct fed microbial? You know, probiotics are live microorganisms that benefit the host. You've probably heard you have more cells living or more bacteria living in you and on you than cells of your own body. And that's true. We live in a symbiotic relationship. Okay. So they benefit us for the most part. Okay. So bacteria are not all bacteria are dangerous. Okay. You have a lot of bacteria in your body that are very, very helpful. And so generally speaking, you know, the most general definition of a probiotic is it's a live microorganism that has been shown to be beneficial to the host. It's beneficial to the calf. It's beneficial to you. A lot of times they'll include things like lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, also Saccharomyces species, so yeast. So it doesn't have to be just a bacteria, Enterococcus, and more recently we've seen kind of a rapid commercial influx of various bacillus species. Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria are very temperature sensitive and oxygen sensitive. So they're kind of a pain in the butt to manufacture and handle from a commercial standpoint. So that where bacillus are spore formers, they're very temperature sensitive. You can pellet these things and you say that there's this much alive, there's going to be that much alive a little bit later. Enterococcus species, there's some things there, but generally speaking, they're also fairly temperature sensitive. So we did a study where we had 3 groups. We had a control group, just fed milk replacer, had a control group that we challenged with Salmonella at 7 days of life. And then I had a group that we fed a blend of 2 probiotic strains and challenged them at 7 days. Back to my kids being born, I grew that Salmonella, handed it to the student, said, go challenge the calves, and I'll see you when the study's over, because my son was being born in the hospital that day. But it was funny, I talked to him the next day and he's like, I don't think it's working. Because he walked into the barn and all the calves were alive. And I was like, well, we're taking rectal temperatures. Like, well, the temperatures are going up. I was like, I know a lot about that challenge model. Rectal temperatures peak at 3 days. It's a really bad challenge if you walk in the next day and all of them are laying on their side. Okay, so it was actually a really, really nice challenge response that we got. So we harvested the calves at 21 days. I'll show you some of the intestinal stuff. So this is an inflammation marker. Sorry that this didn't come over, but so the bigger, this is a case where bigger's not better. Okay, so this is where you want to keep this low. So the control group here, and I don't know why I have the control group in the middle, but you know, the control group, and then what I would expected when we challenge them with salmonella, they should get more inflammation. Okay, but you know, interestingly, the control and the control plus salmonella both were high. Okay, and then our probiotic that was challenged with salmonella was reduced relative to the two of those. So just even, you know, challenging these with salmonella, you know, they were lower than the control that wasn't challenged with salmonella. So that was interesting. This is looking at two different sections of the intestines. So again, what we would expect, this is looking at the villi height. So again, the smaller they get, that means they've been blunted. And the reason they're getting blunted is there's damage to them. And they're trying to decrease they're decreasing their surface area. I always joke, you're a terrible fighter. You've never seen a guy walk into a boxing ring like this, right? With keeping his surface area really high, right? He's always trying to reduce his surface area. And so typically what you see like on the duodenum here, so the control animals were here, and then when we challenged them with salmonella, they blunted their villi, so they got smaller. The probiotic fed animals basically prevented that. So it was a nice response there. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about an absorbent, because this is something we've worked on over the last 5 years. So this is an absorbent that we developed. And so this is from a publication, a dose response investigation of a microporous ceramic particle. And this was done in post-weaned pigs infected with salmonella. But this is an electron micrograph. It kind of looks like a meteor. It's about a 40 micron size particle. What we've done now with this particle is we've micronized it even smaller to where we can get it to float in milk. And so we use this absorbent quite a bit in, you know, the interesting thing is the grad student at the time, she was looking at a lot of water filtration research and basically said, you know, there's a lot of ceramics used in water filtration. So we kind of dug into activated charcoals and ceramics and blends of them. And what she ended up doing, we developed an assay to look at its ability to reduce. A water filtration assay was the first thing we did. And basically what she proved, without going into the details, ceramic particle, activated carbon, a couple different just generic clays off the market. And we looked at the ability to remove Salmonella typhimurium, Salmonella Dublin, and an E. coli K99. And basically in the food safety world, you want to get a 1 log reduction. So what we did is we started with 1 million E. coli on the top. You pass it through it, and then you measure how much comes out the bottom. And so if you get to a 1 log reduction, that means you went from 1 million down to 100,000. You take off a 0. If you went to a 2 log reduction, that means you took off 2 zeros. So it went from 1 million down to 10,000. Okay, so it's a big reduction when you go from 1 million. Like if I gave you a glass of water, I said there's 1 million E. coli there, or there's 100,000 E. coli over here. Which one would you choose? You choose the one that's 100,000. It's 10 times less, right? So you're less likely, you're still like, say a little prayer that your GI tract, and you'd probably go to the store and maybe get a probiotic or ask me if I have any of this absorbent with me. Okay, so it does reduce, at least in our water filtration system. Then it was pretty close to activated charcoal. And we did some interesting things with blending the things, and there is some synergy between them. But what we did is we put this into pigs, wean diets, and saw some improvements. But the more recent thing we did is we did this is a calf that's under anesthesia. And what we do is we open the animal up and we tie off little 1-inch sections of the intestines. And what I can do, I can get about 18 of them in the calf and still be in the ileum. What I can do is I can infuse like sterile saline that I would give an IV into 3 of the loops. And in 3 random loops, I'll inject salmonella by itself. Or 3 of the loops, I'll do salmonella with the binder that we're testing in this case, or 3 loops with salmonella plus moss, okay? And then what we do is we tuck them back into this calf. And what we figured out is we got to keep that calf alive for 4 hours under anesthesia. Then we euthanize the animal and we take out the sections of the intestines. It takes 4 hours in this model for that salmonella to cause damage. to the intestine. So this is what this looks like. So again, villi length, and I'll just show. So this was the control, meaning that those were the loops that were challenged with sterile saline. So they had a size of 550, okay, micrometer. When we put salmonella into the loops, it dropped down to like 375. So again, we got blunting, we got damage, okay? And then look, when we put salmonella with the binder, we basically prevented the blunting. So we prevented the damage that was done to it. And we've done that not only with salmonella, but I've also put purified E. coli endotoxin, okay, LPS in the gut. Interesting thing is that you have to infuse a lot of endotoxin in the gut to get inflammation in the gut. The gut is pretty anti-inflammatory. That's for a different story. This is also same data set. This is measuring the number of neutrophils, so our pus producing cells. Okay, so these are your somatic cell counts. They're called somatic cell counts if they're in the mammary gland. They're just still called a neutrophil if they're in the intestines, but you don't want them in the intestines. Like you don't really want a bunch of them in your milk gland because there's something in mammary gland because there's something wrong there. So this is measuring the number of neutrophils that are in a section, a specific area of the intestines. So the control sterile saline, they had about 2. Whereas when we infused it with endotoxin, they got up to 12. So they had an influx. It's like the somatic cell count going up, right? They're responding to that tissue and causing a bunch of damage is what they're doing. And they're probably causing some of this blunting. But when we infused the endotoxin with the binder, we were able to prevent a lot of that. So some interesting data in terms of the use of absorbents. I'll just kind of skip over this. This is something else that we're working on in trying to inhibit Clostridium perfringens. So kind of my take home is there's a lot of holes in the GI system and it's undergoing rapid maturation. Okay, so my strategy is nutrition is an attractive approach because nutrition from a GI makes a lot of sense because that's where the problem is. So you can provide things directly to the side of the problem. It's harder for me to go, okay, and I have a review article where I wrote this. I said, to feed a probiotic and reduce metritis, I have a hard time connecting those dots. I'd rather shove the DFM into the uterus or put it in the vagina or whatever. I think that makes more sense because I'm putting it where it potentially could have some impact. Okay, so that's what I'm saying is like nutrition, the problem is in the GI tract. So the solution's also in the GI tract. So nutrition is an attractive approach. And from a generic mechanistic standpoint, the way my brain thinks is if I can reduce the interaction of a potential pathogen, because animals are going to be exposed. Again, good management is keeping the calf healthy, dry, and trying to reduce exposure to microorganisms. But the fact of the day is that a lot of animals are exposed to microorganisms. And when I talk to calf ranches, I tell them, my assumption is every single animal is exposed to salmonella. So now the question is how are you going to try to mitigate it? Okay. And we've developed an ELISA assay to measure antibody titers to salmonella. And more often than not, no matter what facility I go on, calves are exposed to salmonella. So, the fact of the matter is, yeah, we can do a lot of management things to try to reduce exposure, but we can also do some things in nutrition to try to reduce the ability of that pathogen once it is exposed to the calf to cause damage. Okay. It's a lot harder. I would rather have somebody break into my house if he was handcuffed, okay, versus coming in with I live in Texas. Most likely he's going to have a gun. I'm also going to have a gun. So, but point is, if you handicap the potential pathogen, you're going to greatly reduce the amount of damage that they can cause. And then I also want to look at strategies to improve the GI immune system maturation. Is that by feeding low levels of colostrum? Maybe. Is that by feeding some other things that are going to stimulate like butyric acid production? Some DFMs do that, or supplementing butyric acid where we can just improve what that gut looks like. I used to enjoy doing a lot of research because it was fairly inexpensive to buy calves for my studies. Now I'm back to trying to find Jersey bull calves to do studies because I look at a lot of intestines, and now there's not very many Jersey bull calves either. So They use them for roping steers out in our neck of the woods. So here's something that we did. This was a student I saw. She went to the Ohio State University. She did her master's with me, and she's now back in Indiana, but actually back in Ohio. She did this trial. And the reason I say this is the first time I ever met her. I had met her, and then she came, but I showed up with 120 calves. The first time I saw her in Lubbock, I gave her 120 calves, and I left like 3 days later for a work trip, and I came back and it was a disaster. Okay, every single calf was scouring, and calves were dying left and right. We ran 50% mortality in the control group. It happened to be the study design was half the calves were fed a control group, nothing. It was a component-based milk system, and then the other half of the calves were supplemented with a blend of almost everything I just showed you. Okay, binders, moss, probiotics, vitamins and trace minerals, some lysine and methionine. Okay, so we had 60 calves on the control group, 60 calves fed. That was the only difference between the two. They ran about 75% failure of passive transfer. So they were high-risk calves. It was 106. I forgot to mention that when I dropped these calves off. So heat stress, just a lot of problems. Okay, so this is a survival curve here. So 100% of the calves started alive, and you have two groups here. So this group right down here, almost at like 21 days, is getting about 55%. That means only 55% of the calves were alive after 21 days. So that's where I said the control group, we lost almost half the calves. Whereas the other treatment, they all got scours. Every single calf got scours, like shooting out. Really high rotavirus, really high rotavirus, coronavirus, crypto, E. coli, salmonella. They had it all. But we only lost 12% of the other ones. And when I looked at the weaning weights of the animals in this treatment, those animals did really, really well. So that goes back to my original statement of, a lot of what I'm trying to do is, I want to reduce the incidence of mortality. I want to reduce the incidence of scours, but I also want to improve the ability of those animals to recover from disease. And I always tell any grad student in the room, if you want to make a career, I'd be happy to help you study how can we improve recovery from disease, because nobody's really doing that. And I've been preaching that for a while. Maybe I'm too old to do it now, but I'll get somebody to do it. Okay. So with that, I'll be here for lunch, and then I'm driving to Orlando to fly out tomorrow. So, but thanks for, this is the starter intake, and I've got performance data on this, but again, those calves did really well. But again, appreciate being here. Look forward to visiting with a few of you over lunch.